Okay, recording should start. So welcome to everybody. This is the May edition for International Legume Society webinars. And we are glad to have here with us Pietro Barbieri from École Nationale Supérieure at Bordeaux Sciences Agro, where he teaches, is associate professor, teaches systemic agronomy. This month webinar will be a nice continuation of last two editions. A couple of months ago in March, we had Professor Michele Udvardi from Australia, where we talked about the symbiotic relationship between nitrogen fixation in legume and microorganism that lives in the roots of legumes. Last month, with Eric Just from CIRAD, we talked about intercropping, which is again a way that leverages this interaction with the nitrogen fixation rhizome and crops. And this month, Pietro will talk about nitrogen fixing crops as the interface between crop and livestock production. So without further ado, I leave the mic to Pietro, and you can start your presentation.
Thank you. I will share my screen. Okay, so normally you should see my presentation now.
Yes, we see.
Perfect. So thank you for inviting me. So just a small brief introduction about my work. I'm an agronomist, as Nelson said, and I've been especially focusing in the last year on some perspective studies at the global and European scale that aimed at understanding the main issues that could arise when we imagine scenario of expansion of agroecology in general at the European scale or at the global scale, and especially focused on organic farming as one of the agroecological systems that we can imagine to be one of the main future agricultural methods that could be applied. So my presentation will be focused with a big intro. We start with a big introduction concerning the nitrogen cycle and some of the main issues that for sure you know at the global scale, and then I will try to show you some of the results about the consequences of agroecological scenarios on the nitrogen cycle and on leguminous crop. And underlining the relation between crop production and nitrogen crops and the livestock production side. And then I will try to show you how I think on my vision how leguminous crop could be one of potential solution of the problem that I will try to highlight in the introduction. So just to start very globally, as you might know, at the global scale or the very large scale, current agricultural systems and especially crop production and livestock production system has strongly impacted global nitrogen cycles. So as you can see in these two graphs, you see on the left side the different flows that are linked to agricultural activities, both crop activities, crop production and livestock production. So in the blue color, especially focusing on the agricultural sector at the center. As you can see, of course, modern agricultural activity has strongly impacted those nitrogen flows at the global scale by the use of fertilizers and by intensifying our production system. And I guess that you all know also the figure on the left side of this slide, which reports what we call let's say the impacts of different spheres over the planetary boundaries. So a concept that came out some years ago about the intensity or the excessive intensity of our systems, our agricultural system, the global scale. And as you can see, of course, the nitrogen element, so the biogeological flows in terms of nitrogen is well known that is largely overpassing the safe operating space, so the natural functioning, let's say, of the nitrogen cycle at the global scale due to current agricultural activities. So this is a first, let's say, a first point, yeah, that I wanted to do to make. The second important thing to consider is in this context of impact of agricultural activities over the nitrogen cycle, is that, of course, the agricultural activities of the crop and the livestock production are strongly interdependent in between each other via, thanks to the flows that are generated via the production of feed and the production of manure into the two systems, and the exchanges in terms of nitrogen that we can imagine, nitrogen and crop and biomass in general, that we can imagine between the two production activities. And as you can see, agricultural activity has also generated a massive increase of flows of reactive nitrogen towards the environment. So nitrogen under reactive forms, and of course, crop and livestock mainly contribute to the most of those new introduction of reactive nitrogen into the systems. And the two graphs just represents let's say some values of such a process. The third point that I think is important to keep in mind when we speak about, let's say, consequences at large scale is also that we are in phase, as you for sure know, at the agricultural activities that are linked to an opening of the, I'm very sorry, there are some works here, so I hope you can hear me. That are linked to the segregation between production and consumption of agricultural biomass. And this here report here an example for France. As you can see, globally, trade flows has strongly impacted and opened the cycle of biochemical cycle, for example, for nitrogen. And this has increased the dependencies of nitrogen resources, especially for the livestock system, where currently modern livestock production activities are dependent on resources that are produced somewhere else in the world. So when we consider all these 3 points together, it's clear that nowadays we push for, in general, we have a tendency of looking for alternative production method that could help in closing the nitrogen cycles and in decreasing the environmental impact over the losses due to the agricultural activities. And of course, when we speak about the agroecological transition, one of the agricultural model that we can imagine to put behind this agricultural transition may be organic farming. And this is because organic farming has there are a lot of let's say research results that tells us that organic farming may have a better performance over a series of parameters, economical parameter, environmental parameter, etc. So it can be a good candidate for such transition. What about in terms of nitrogen? Organic farming could also be a candidate to help closing the nitrogen cycles, and this could be done by several ways that we'll discuss later, by using especially nitrogen fixing crops to help reconnecting crop and livestock production and helping closing those cycles. So in the last, let's say, 10 years, there have been several studies that have been published over this subject, which is what are the consequences at the very large scale of a potential let's say, conversion of the world or Europe to organic farming. And in this slide, you just see three of the, let's say, out of all those papers that have been published, three of the main scenarios paper that have worked over the question. So a first paper that was published in 2015 from a Swiss team at FIBOL, focusing at the global scale. A second paper that was published by colleague Laurence Smith in England, that focused on the impact over the nitrogen cycles in England and Wales. And finally, a study that we published in 2021, focusing once again at the global scale. So we'll try now to show you what are the results, the main results over those three studies. So the first thing to retain is that when we speak about nitrogen resources and the conversion to agroecology, but we see that in those scenarios of expansion of agroecology and organic farming at a global scale, we come out with a problem in terms of nitrogen resources in order to sustain crop productivity. So what you see in this graph, which is taken from the paper from Muller et al., you see different combination between several variables, and the two important variables is the share of organic farming at the global scale, so between 0 and 100% on the x-axis, and then a series of consumption, let's say, consumption variables like the reduction of consumption waste and the reduction of food feed competition, so the competition between animal and cropland production. So what is important to retain is that when you look at the scenarios converting 100% of the global area to organic farming, so the last column, we have some negative value, which means that the nitrogen balance between the crop uptake and the nitrogen resources is negative, showing that we have a nitrogen deficit in those scenarios to answer to the crop demand for food and feed production. So what the consequence of this? A first example of consequence at the national scale was shown by the colleague in England. So these graphs on the right side shows you the organic and the conventional production level when we imagine the old country, in this case England, is converted to organic farming. As you can see, mostly organic production, so the clear blue, the bars in clear blue, is mostly lower than the production in the conventional scenario, and this decrease in productivity, of course, is linked to this lack of nitrogen as resources. So this shows the problem at the national scale, and we have similar results actually at the global scale. Here, another results from a study that I mentioned before that we conducted a couple of years ago, and in this map you can see on the bottom part a map that shows you the productivity increase or reduction in comparison to the current situation when we convert the whole world to organic farming, so to agroecology. As you can see, most of the color is orange, meaning that in an organic world, we would produce less than what we produce nowadays. And this decrease in productivity is mainly due to a problem of nitrogen. And this is shown by the graph at the first part of the graph, the different bars. As you can see, the red bar shows you the contribution of nitrogen limitation to this decrease in cropland production. As you can see, we have about 77% of this reduction, which is represented by a nitrogen problem. So once again, underlining the importance of these nitrogen resources and a real problem that could arise when we imagine conversion scenarios to organic farming or more in general agroecology. Yeah, so this second maps explains once more what I just have said. So in this map, you see once again the world, and what is represented here is the average nitrogen. So our nitrogen budgets expressed in kilogram nitrogen per hectare, and so all the points in the map that are shown in orange represent areas where we identify a potential nitrogen deficit in comparison to the cropland demand, which correspond at the global level at about 40 kilogram per hectare on average at the global level. So once again, in most countries, especially where agricultural systems are quite industrialized nowadays, we would have this nitrogen lack. So what the consequence now of and slowly coming to the main topic of today, so the consequence of the relation between cropland and livestock production. So the model that we used to simulate the maps that I just show you on the right side is able to simulate crop yields under scenarios of organic expansion, but also to simulate what are the consequences for the livestock sector. So in the next slide, I will show you what the model forecast in terms of livestock population in a scenario of expansion of 100% of a world that would be cultivated 100% under organic farming. So in this slide, you see the result of our modeling exercise. On the left side, so the map with the letter A represent the relative increase or decrease in the ruminant livestock species in the 100% organic scenario in comparison to the current situation. And on the left side, so the graph with the letter B represent the same, but for the monogastric population. So here we see two important things. The first is that livestock would be, let's say, the areas where we produce nowadays would not correspond to the areas where is optimal to have some livestock farming at the global scale. So we have a change in the geographical distribution of the different species. But what is more important is, as you can see, in the map on the left side about ruminants, we have areas where ruminants decrease in orange, but also we have a lot of areas where the number of ruminants would increase, so the color in blue, which is completely different from the map on the left side, where mostly we saw a decrease of monogastric population, either a stable number, either a decrease of those monogastrics. And this is also shown by the two bars in yellow and violet color at the bottom of the two maps. So why this is important is because it shows that in an agroecological or in organic world, ruminant livestock would have a primary role, let's say, would have much more let's say, livestock systems that are based on ruminant animal over monogastric animal. And the reason of that is because ruminants, of course, can valorize some resources that we cannot consume directly, and those resources are represented by more in general fodder resources, so forages, which are often involve, of course, some nitrogen fixing crops. And so the link between the nitrogen flows, cropland production, nitrogen fixing crop, and the ruminants population is evidently shown by this change of behavior in terms of type of population that we produce. And to end this long introduction, let's say here a last slide showing you the result, the global result in terms of production of our 100% organic world simulated in comparison to the current situation. And what I wanted to highlight here is that, as I was saying before, we have an increase of the ruminant population, and so a higher share of permanent and temporary grassland production that is valorized by those livestock animals. And of course, this increased valorization of fodder resource, if we imagine that those permanent grassland production can be produced by valorizing nitrogen fixing crops, we also come to a potential leverage point to a potential solution to the nitrogen problem that I showed you before, by with a double effect, the effect of including more nitrogen fixing crops, so taking advantage for the nitrogen fixation capacity, so the inputs of nitrogen into the system by the nitrogen fixation, and at the same time valorizing those crops to produce high value food via the production of ruminant animals, so milk or meat production. Yeah, so we come to the point. The question that we wonder is how we can facing this problem of nitrogen lack in those scenarios of organic farming expansion or agroecological expansion more in general, how we can value nitrogen fixing crops in order, or could nitrogen fixing crop be a leverage to solve or attenuate such problem in those scenarios? And of course, we could imagine to introduce or increase the number of nitrogen fixing crop that we could cultivate at the European, national, or global scale by introducing those leguminous crop into current cropping system via under different forms. So you could imagine, of course, to use nitrogen fixing crops, as I was mentioning before, mailing as permanent or temporary fodders. But also we can imagine to introduce those crops within a range of agronomical solution, using them as cover crops, as intercrops, as green manures, or of course, as cultivate them as pulse as main crop. So we have I think a huge set of possibilities of introducing, of optimizing the use of those nitrogen fixing crop at the cropping system level. So why I think that we think that the leguminous crop could be an opportunity. Of course, as you for sure you know, as I was saying before, the effect of introducing, of optimizing the number of the use of nitrogen fixing crop at the cropping system level would be a direct contribution to the fertility by increasing the amount of nitrogen available resources for the cropping system by valorizing, let's say, these nitrogen flows from the atmosphere that are captured via the nitrogen fixation of those of pulse or fodder crops. But also because we know quite well nowadays that using nitrogen fixing crops also helps in reducing the amount of reactive net nitrogen that we introduce to the system. So also helping in limiting one of the problems that I was mentioning at the beginning of my introduction. And so, in other words, to increase, to optimize the recycling rate, allowing a lower input of this reactive nitrogen. And of course, on the other side, to reduce nitrogen losses from our cropping system. And the third point is that the use of the leguminous crop is important for the nitrogen fixation, but also for the potential in terms of protein production, protein that can be consumed, of course, by us, if we speak about pulse, but also protein can be valorized, as I was mentioning before, by the livestock sector. And so those leguminous crops could allow to increase the nitrogen use efficiency of our agricultural systems in general. Sorry. So this is those points that I mentioned here are mostly impacting, let's say, the nitrogen cycle at the local scale, at the farm scale, let's say. But the interaction between nitrogen fixing crop and the livestock sector could also have some important impacts at the larger scale, at the territorial scale, or at the regional scale. And this is true because of the fact that is represented in this slide. So when animals consume, for example, a cow consumes some nitrogen fixing crop under the form of a fodder crop, for example, but it valorizes these resources by producing some high value food, some milk, some meat, but also by producing some fertilizing resource, some manure that can be displaced and used over to fertilize, for example, cropland soils that then will be used to produce some cereals or some oil crops that can be directly used for human or animal production. In any case, what is represented here is what we call a fertility transfer in between areas that are allocated to fodder production, either temporary or permanent pasture, and areas that are allocated to cropland production. And animals are a good way to operate this fertility transfer and to optimize this fertility transfer between those different, let's say, areas of production at the territorial scale. Things that is much more difficult to operate if animal livestock, so if ruminants are not present in a specific region or a specific territory. So I will try now to show you some evidence of the different points that I mentioned here. So coming back to the impact at the, let's say, farm scale or the plot scale, the first point that I made is that, of course, nitrogen fixing crops could help in introducing, in increasing the number, the amount of resources that are available for cropland production. So to try to quantify this, a couple of years ago, we ran a project to understand if leguminous crop, what would be the potential of nitrogen fixation in between pulse or leguminous crop that are managed organically or conventionally. So would leguminous crop have a different, a better potential of fixing nitrogen under an organic production methods in comparison to the conventional one. So in this slide, you see some of the results of our study that shows you gives you some reference of nitrogen fixation for the organic system. So in the values that are highlighted in the green box at the beginning of the table, as in comparison to values that we can find in the literature about the fixation level in conventional managed soils. So as you can see, the results are not really so clear. So we couldn't really find a very clear link between a very clear difference, let's say, in the biological fixation under the conventional and organic production methods. Is really dependent on the different crop species. But what was let's say, the behavior that was more clear was about fodder crops. So as you look at some crop species, for example, alfalfa or fodder crops in general, we found a clear higher fixation rate in terms of kilogram of nitrogen that are introduced into the system per year, which with higher flows for those fodder crops in organic as in comparison to conventional farming, which highlights even more the possible advantage that we have in introducing those fodder crops into our agroecological systems and to valorize them via the livestock production. So here another slide that shows you pretty much a similar thing. Once again, some values of nitrogen fixation in terms of kilogram of nitrogen fixed per hectare per year. And as I was mentioning before, we could imagine to introduce those nitrogen fixing crop under several forms. And so we try to understand if certain ways of introducing those nitrogen fixing crop into cropping system would be more interesting in terms of nitrogen flows, nitrogen input into the system. And once again, so these two graphs that you see here gives you some values of fixation NDFA, so nitrogen fixed in the above ground biomass for different crop species on the right side of different management strategies on the left side. And so once again, you see here that the highest value are represented for fodder crops, especially for perennial fodder crops, so for nitrogen fixing crop that would last at least 1, 2, or 3 years in our increasing nitrogen resources at this level. So yeah, so this shows you actually good potential for those crops, especially fodders, as once again to increase the availability of nitrogen resources. So this was about the first point that I made before. Yeah, we also spoke about the consequences in terms of protein production. And here just an estimation that was done by a colleague some years ago about the potential productivity in terms of protein, comparing some, once again, fodder crops and some cereals or some oil crops, expressed here with some references. Of course, this was the figures that you see here were were estimated in under French condition, but what is important to retain is that on average we have a higher production of proteins per unit of area when we consider those fodder resources as in comparison to some resources that are commonly used for livestock feed, for example, silage, corn, or some main cereals or oil crops. And the important thing is that those proteins, those protein resources are produced using crops that are normally not fertilized or that receive the very low nitrogen fertilization, which means that we also increase the nitrogen use efficiency of the system because we are able to produce a higher amount of nitrogen expressed under protein resources with a lower use of a lower need of fertilizing those crops, thanks, of course, to their ability to fix the main part of the nitrogen that we find their biomass. And the graph on the bottom side just shows you is explicative of this lower use of nitrogen fertilization under permanent or temporary pastures in comparison to average cropland. Yeah, especially when you think about, of course, fertilization using nitrogen under the mineral form. Another fact about this increase of end-use efficiency, but I guess that you have seen pretty well this during the previous seminar with Eric Justes about associate cropping, is, as we know, when we associate into fodder crops, legumes and grass, we have an enhanced complementarity effect between the different species. And what we've shown here is that, of course, this complementarity leads to a higher nitrogen fixation in comparison to the same fodder crop cultivated as sole crop, and a higher biomass production also. So expressed here in the graph under the form of nitrogen in comparison to for both the grass and the legume component, as in comparison to the true sole crop. So showing that the association of leguminous and grass, so leguminous and cereals plants really could boost this effect of nitrogen fixation and increase even more the nitrogen use efficiency of the system. And this is an effect, of course, on the two species that are, or the several species that are cultivated together, but also is pretty known, what you call the preceding crop effect, linked to the introduction of nitrogen fixing plant over the, let's say, nitrogen budget of the overall cropping system, which is just shown by the example on the left side of the slide, where you can see that we have a higher effect on the crop following a leguminous species or a mixed grass system as temporary fodder in comparison to a fodder which is mainly cultivated by a non-nitrogen fixing species. So once again, underlining the potential contribution that those fodder crops could bring into the nitrogen cycle at the cropping season level. On this complementary, on this discussion about the complementarity between leguminous and grass system, we also try to see if organic system could bring a difference in terms of the fraction of the nitrogen we find in a biomass of the leguminous crop or a grass crop in comparison to conventional management. So on the left side of this slide, you see once again a result from the study that I was mentioning before, but this time showing you not the net amount of nitrogen which is bringing to the system, but the share of the total nitrogen we find in the biomass, which is coming from the atmosphere. So the share of the total nitrogen which is fixed by those crops. But once again, we see that fodder crops fix quite a large amount. But interestingly, we found that fodder mixture, so a mixture between fodder and grass, didn't lead actually to a higher amount of nitrogen fixed, which is goes a bit on the other sense in comparison to the results that I showed you before. So a bit maybe questioning whether this effect is really enhanced by an organic management in comparison to the conventional one. And this is also shown by the table on the left side. As you can see for fodder, so the value that is highlighted in red, we also find that under the organic management, fodders were on average fixing a lower amount in terms of percentage amount of nitrogen fixed in the biomass in comparison to current value that you find in the literature refer to conventional farming. So this means that there should be, it would be interesting to investigate a bit more between this effect, which goes a bit in contrast in comparison to the results that I showed you before. Okay, so the other point that I mentioned before was about the decrease of nitrogen losses and the increase of recycling rate. Here, once again, nothing really new. On the left side of this slide, you see an example of the cumulative nitrogen leaching under different cropping system, and it's well known, of course, that in the introduction of grassland and especially mixed grassland can be a strong leverage to decrease nitrogen leaching in cropping system, and so to decrease nitrogen losses. So once again, the introduction of legumes, and not only legumes, of course, in terms of nitrogen leaching, but temporary fodders in general could be a strong leverage on this point. And It can also be a leverage in the case of recycling biomass, as I will show you in one slide after, since of course the interaction between the livestock and the fodder and the cropland component more in general, as I was mentioning before, allows to value some resources and to recycle some of those nitrogen via the transfer, the manure managed transfers in between grassland and cropland production. And by producing so a substrate, so manure with a high fertility value to valorize those exchanges between grassland areas and cropland areas. And to show you, I show you a bit better these beneficial these benefits, let's say, in terms of closing the nitrogen cycle and increasing the recycle rate. I will switch now at the territorial scale. And here in this slide, you see some results from a study that were done here in Bordeaux some years ago. About the impact of the presence of livestock at the territorial scale in terms of autonomy for the nitrogen resources or the protein, and the recycle of resources at the territorial scale. So here you see the results from 3 different regions in France. A region on the left which is specialized in cropland production, a second region in the middle, which is a region where we both find some cropland and some livestock farming, and a region on the left side, which is specialized in livestock production. And the flows, the different arrows shows you the different exchange in terms of nitrogen resources or in terms of biomass, which are so the different resources which are exchanged between the different farms. And as you can see clearly, we have the most of the arrow in the second region, so the mixed farming region, which is the region that is characterized by the higher autonomy in terms of nitrogen local autonomy, and also the highest recycling rate, showing you once again that the presence of livestock is key to link cropland production and livestock production via the nitrogen and biomass flows in between those two components. And if we look now at the different if we try to quantify those flows that I showed you before, just on a qualitative point of view, here you see the quantification between the flows that comes from a farm, so an agricultural hectare or a non-farm hectare. So the non-farm hectare is represented by the black color, and the organic and conventional farm are represented by the white color in the bars. And you clearly see that in the mixed district, we have a much higher exchange between farms, meaning that we have a recycle rate which is much higher in comparison to the other territories, the other regions, and so a higher higher level of, let's say, the nitrogen cycle is much more close the local scale into this in this region in comparison to the crop district and the livestock district. And this is true both for fertilizing material and for crop-based protein flows in terms of feed resources for the livestock sector. Of course, behind these inflows, a higher part of these flows in the mixed sector is represented by nitrogen flows coming by the nitrogen fixation of those nitrogen fixing plants, as shown in the right side. Okay, so now I will, let's say, jump back at the global scale, and I will try to show you what could be the consequences of those transition scenarios when we assume a much stronger reliance on nitrogen fixing crops, not at the farm scale or the regional scale, but once again, going back to this continental or global scale. So when we imagine of simulating scenarios of transition where nitrogen fixing plants are optimized or are increased as much as possible, of course, this increase goes impacts, let's say, the nitrogen cycle at the global scale or the European scale, depending on which focusing scale we are focusing. So here, just an example showing you global nitrogen flows between a conventional, once again, and 100% organic scenarios. And as you can see, we have a huge change in terms of the flows in between the grassland, permanent and temporary grassland, and the livestock components. So the arrows on the in the left side, so the organic scenarios are much bigger in the organic scenarios than in the conventional scenarios. Once again, showing you that there is a strong optimization of nitrogen resources and the use of those fodder fixing crops by the livestock sector, and especially the ruminant animal. What we see here is also that in this simulation that we have done, the impacts of over the nitrogen fixation are a bit less important than what we expected. So there's not such a huge increase, at least in our simulation, of the total amount of nitrogen that was fixed in between the conventional and the organic scenario. At least for the cropland, for the nitrogen fixing plant that were included into the cropland part, not on the grassland side, of course. But this is just an example of the study. There has been other studies that has been published after our exercise, especially a study that was published by another group in France in 2021. That try to simulate another conversion scenario to organic farming and to agroecology more in general at global scale. And in these scenarios, the author considered that N-fixing crops were really optimized as much as possible into cropland, into cropping system at the European scale. And on the right side, on the table, you see the share of nitrogen fixing crops, so the frequency of nitrogen fixing crops that were assumed at the cropping system level for different nations. And for example, if you see in France or Finland or Germany, if I take 3 examples, about 60 to 70% of the crop rotation that were simulated in those studies include a huge share of nitrogen fixing crops. So really boosting the use of nitrogen fixing crops in comparison to what we observe nowadays. And the result of this is that the flows, so here another representation very similar to the one that I showed before, but for this additional study. And as you can see, the flows of symbiotic nitrogen fixation in between what we observe currently in these agroecological scenarios are this time very much amplified in comparison to the exercise that we've done here in Bordeaux. So the arrow of symbiotic nitrogen fixation is much bigger on the right side in comparison to the left. And once again, we have a huger share of so the recycle loop in between nitrogen flows between the permanent grassland, the livestock component, and the cropland component are optimized in the agroecological scenarios in comparison to the current scenarios. So once again, underlining this linkage between the livestock mediated fertility and the nitrogen fixing component of the cropping systems. The consequence of this is, of course, if we look a bit bigger, is that these scenarios of agroecological farming in 2050 would cause a huge change in our consumption habits, and especially we would need to have a huger share of our dietary regime, which is covered by crop-based, by consuming more let's say, vegetable proteins in comparison to animal proteins, as you see pie chart on the right side of the two graphs. Yeah, and similarly, a similar result here in terms of impacts over the consumption of the crop component and the animal component at the global scale. And also you see here that there would be quite an impact in terms of the amount of cropland of cereals that are produced at the global scale, but this impact is much more reduced for the production of permanent grassland and the fodder component, showing that the relative importance of those fodder crops would increase even much more into those scenarios in comparison to the current practices. And a last result, about those transition scenarios, assuming a strong reliance of nitrogen fixing crops, coming from another study that you might know, which was called the TIFA, the 10 years for agroecology, was a scenario that was published a couple of years ago, once again by a French team at the European scale, simulating a transition to not organic farming, but to an agroecological system. And once again, here you see on the table on the left side that the projection to 2050 that were made by the author involves a much higher share of pulse and legume crops into crop rotation and a higher share of temporary grasslands. And once again, we observe the same impact on the livestock population, which is a much higher share of ruminant livestock over the overall population, with a strong decrease of monogastric, but a kind of stable number, much more stable number of ruminant livestock, because they are the only animal that can valorize those fodder resources. And a different repartition in terms of nitrogen flows in between nitrogen coming from manure. So there's effect of nitrogen transfer between permanent fodder resources or pasture, temporary or permanent pasture that I was mentioning before, and the cropland component. And of course, also here, the huge impact in terms of the nitrogen flows linked to the nitrogen fixing, the direct nitrogen fixation of the due to the introduction of such leguminous crop into the cropping systems at the European scale. So if we try to come of conclusion now, the point that I try to make in this presentation is that nitrogen fixing crops, and especially non-food crops, so fodder crops and cover crops, can really be a major leverage to help closing the nitrogen cycle at the local scale, at the regional scale, but also at the national or continental scale when we look with a bit at a larger scale, for three reasons: because they contribute, of course, to the nitrogen fixation, so to increase the availability of nitrogen resources and nitrogen inputs at the cropping system level, because they help in optimizing the nitrogen usage efficiency and in optimizing the nitrogen cycling rate, especially in terms of reactive nitrogen, which is introduced into the systems. And on the other side, they allow also maximizing the protein autonomy of farms in general, so optimizing this linkage between the cropland and the livestock component at the farm scale. Nevertheless, just before concluding, a couple of let's say negative point, let's say, of obstacles. So the problem is that I think today, more on a personal side, we face a number of obstacles to the increase of such nitrogen fixing crops at the cropping system level over 2 points. The first point is that, as we well know, that mixed crop livestock systems, so what we call in English integrated crop livestock for farming, not forestry, sorry, crop livestock farming systems are systems that are much more complex, that requires much more skills to be managed by farmers, and so we tend to see a decrease of those systems at least at the European scales, instead of an increase of those mixed system at the European scale for those for these three reasons I just mentioned. And in terms of increasing the share of leguminous crop, we also observe the current presence of what we call some lock-ins that prevents a bit the increase of the use of those nitrogen fixing crops, especially in terms of pulse. And this is because in several areas, in several regions, this is true for France, in the French case, but I think it's also true for many other countries. Agricultural system has specialized, and so we have lost the presence of infrastructure or commercial outlets for those leguminous crop. So in a lot of regions, I think nowadays it's difficult to valorize on the commercial point of view in terms of due to a lack of infrastructure, lack of hectares that works into the valorization of a leguminous crop for human or livestock consumption. And this is the reason for which we have been observed in the last 20 years an overall decrease in the areas that is cultivated. Here an example for pulse. So with, sorry, there are some crop species that have been left in French. So peas, soja, fava beans, etc. have been overall decreasing the cultivated areas at the European scale, due to the lack of those, let's say, commercial options or valorization options in terms of the agro industry after the production level. And the question is that would the organic market be an opportunity, or the market for agroecological products in general be an opportunity for boosting once again the areas of such a pulse? And this question is, I think, would be important to analyze, since we see that the consumption and the cultivated areas with pulse, at least in France, under organic farming, has been increasing in the last year, in opposition to what we observe in terms of the areas cultivated under conventional farming, let's say, which is represented on the graph on the left side. So I don't have, of course, the answer to the question, but I leave it here as a potential further opportunities to drive this increase of nitrogen fixing crops, the optimization of the amount of nitrogen fixing crops that we could imagine to include in the crop sync system. Okay, and I come to the end of my presentation, and of course open to question and discussing with you.
Many thanks, Pietro. It was a very interesting presentation, full of refreshing perspective, especially like at the global scale consideration. If there are any questions from our listeners. Okay, I see Tom that raises his hand, so please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pietro. That's very interesting, and you cover so many broad topics. So I wonder, in the model of organic, would we be promoting meat consumption and decreasing vegetarian consumption, or maybe I misunderstood a bit?
Yeah, good question. Not really. So I showed you actually, so there is the, let's say, we would have an overall decrease of the livestock population, all species confounded, but we would have a much stronger decreases of the monogastric, of the ruminants population. And actually what I didn't specify, that in the ruminant population would be especially the milk producing, so it's the milk side that takes a huge advantage. And this is because but the efficiency of milk production is actually higher in terms of energy production per unit of input in terms of feed in comparison to meat production. And we know, I'm not a super expert of this, but I have some colleagues that have calculated some level of so for each kilojoule of megajoule of energy that enters into a livestock species, if you look at the input and output flows in terms of energy from the livestock sector, the milk sector is the only sector that under certain condition is able to for 1 megajoule that enters to have 1 or more megajoule that exit the system in terms of food production. So is in other terms, is the most efficient livestock production system in a sense.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, so a couple of Carlotta and then Paolo.
Okay. Thank you, Pietro. It was a very nice presentation. I have just one question that maybe I misunderstood it. Maybe you can help me understand better. You said that on the organic systems, pulses, but especially further crops, would fix nitrogen at higher rates than on conventional systems, right?
Yes.
I don't know if it is as simple as I'm saying it. Why do you think that happens? Just because they don't have any fertilizers around, or they are more efficient by themselves?
I think there are a series of so we didn't run an experimental study, so my answer will be mainly based on let's say literature experience, let's say what I could read in the literature. I think there could be several explanations for this, but one of the explanations, of course, is that in organic system where organic systems often rely on a lower availability of mineral nitrogen or mineral form, and so organic leguminous crop in general would be so the nitrogen fixation would be boosted by this lack of nitrogen resources in the system. But that's the point where we found a bit not so clear. So this was quite clear for the fodder crops, was not so clear for the pulse component. And also, I think what is important to say to retain is that we could have a higher fixation in terms of the shared nitrogen which is fixed, but you also overall have lower yields. So whether we manage to bring a higher amount of total net nitrogen into the system is also very linked to the total biomass that is produced by those pulses. So the yield level, let's say, as having a good yield in organic system is even more important if we want to optimize the nitrogen flows via the end fixing crops. Okay. But the higher share I think is mainly due to higher competition for mineral nitrogen into the soil. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Paolo.
Pietro, your last statement just responded to my following question. I was just wondering the reason for these inconsistencies, no, between expected and actual end fixation rate. And I think, the point that the ability to grow of the plant is would be the reason for that. So, and thank you really for the clarity of your presentation, which also kind of I find it stimulating also in relation to food habits of people concerned with the organic farming, and the environment, etc. Thanks.
Yeah, another point that come to my mind on where difference in the expected results and the observed results in terms of fixation. Another reason that could cause this is that organic crops are often, I think, subjected to higher stress in terms of pest disease, illness, and also in terms of sometimes soil compaction, because we have often a higher use of machinery for weed control in organic farming, and this could also have some impacts over the symbiotic relationship between the rhizobium and the pulse, and so we could also not observe what we expect due to this higher presence of stresses in the organic system.
Also, with competition, for example, I mean, there are many reasons for a lower performance.
And about your comment about the let's say global diet, I think this is a very important point. None of the scenarios projection in none of the exercise that we have done or that I could read in the literature, none of the scenarios works if there is not a change in the consumption behavior on our side. So if there is not a decrease of the livestock sourced protein with a increase in terms of in decrease of the consumption of crop proteins in terms of the, so this is a I think a key point, and without that is essential into those. If we imagine to have one day in 2050 in Europe that would be completely converted to agroecological practices in general.
Honestly, what I found particularly interesting is the fact that I mean the fact that reducing monogastric products would be so much more important than reducing products from ruminants, and often people are led to think exactly the opposite, because there are very simple calculations of the amount of protein converted by animals, and then monogastrics have an advantage, but people just forget that we are using resources that are competing then with food resources, unlike ruminants.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people also, there is also the other side of the medal, of course, is that in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, ruminants are overall not the best because of the methane production. But once again, it really depends on the system. There are a lot of studies that shows that, especially for milk production in pasture-based systems, those emissions are partially or totally compensated by the CO2 segregation ability of permanent pastures or temperate grassland. So once again, it really overall, of course, ruminant health emits much more than monogastric, but once again, it really depends on the system that we put behind it. So.
And since you are talking about perspective, and you talk about 2050 and possible changes in several production system, how does climate change fit in this picture? Because I'm not sure if it was calculated when in the projections.
Yeah, it's a good question. So in general, is a parameter which is not really considered in those production. At least in the exercise that we did in my group, we didn't consider climate change because you would have add an additional, let's say, an additional factor to consider. But I think your question is really relevant, especially when especially speaking about nitrogen fixing crops. Maybe it's a bit less relevant for fodder crops, but I think it's very relevant for pulse because we know that but in general, pulse crop species are not the most adapted to a lack of water resources. And what we observed also is that the ability of farmers to succeed in the production of pulses is getting much more difficult due to lack of rain during the sowing times and due to heat stress especially. So I think there is a huge need of resources to the adaptation of pulses to climate change. Because on one side, we know that those crops are essential in terms of fertilization, in terms of nitrogen flows. And on the other side, we might expect that the productivity it becomes, or the success for farmers to cultivate those species could become extremely challenging due to the climatic change. Yeah, so this, I think is a very, very relevant point, what you mentioned here.
Okay. So I guess we reached the end of our chat for today. I just remind to everybody that in September we'll have our conference. That will be the 5th conference, if I remember correctly. No, the fourth conference for the International Legume Society Conference. And there is the website. All the information is also on our website, legumesociety.org. Otherwise, there is the dedicated website in this ILSW-s1e08.com. Once again, I thank Pietro for his contribution. And with this, I say goodbye and see you all in a month or so.
Yeah, thank
Bye.
you once again.